Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. I'm Janet Ivey, Chair of the Laternal Steering Committee and Chief Specialist Watershed Plans and Source Water Protection at Credit Valley Conservation. I'll be your moderator today. On behalf of the committee, Conservation Ontario, and the University of Guelph, I'd like to welcome you all to the Laternal Leadership Project. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Guelph, where I'm located, is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Today, I acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabeg peoples, from whose traditional territory I'm speaking to you. I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Please take a moment to think about the history of the place that you're joining from today. This is the fourth webinar in the Laternal Leadership Project. This topic is one that can be intimidating to talk about at times, but this conversation is one that the Laternal Steering Committee believes to be especially important for us to have as a community. Events of the past year, including the Christian Cooper New York Central Park incident, the death of George Floyd, and the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests worldwide, have highlighted the persistent and structural inequalities that exist within our institutions and remind us that there is still much to be done to move towards true equity and inclusion. We want to spend some time in this webinar discussing what's being done here in Ontario's conservation sector to deliver diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizational initiatives, programs, and projects. We want to focus on tangible takeaways and action items that you can use as professionals and practitioners to make progress within your own organization. And to that end, we've gathered a very knowledgeable group of people to speak about the different ways they're challenging the status quo and taking action to help reduce barriers to accessing nature, create opportunities for collaboration and partners, and showcase the benefits of knowledge transfer. We have 5 presenters today who will all have 20 minutes each to give their talk. Then we'll have time at the end for the speakers to have a discussion and answer some of your questions. A few housekeeping notes for the morning. First of all of our attendees are muted and you will not be able to speak or come on video. You will, however, find a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. At any time during the webinar, I encourage you to type your questions into the box and press enter to have it posted. You may direct questions at individual presenters or at the panel as a whole. You can upvote a question you like by pressing the thumbs up button. We will be reviewing the questions and we'll have time to pose some of them to our panelists during the discussion following the presentations. And of course, feel free to interact with others in the webinar through the chat box. And to our panelists, a reminder to use your mute button when you're not speaking and of course to unmute yourself when you are. So this webinar is being recorded so that others who are not able to attend will be able to listen in when they can. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Ashu Anand, Senior Coordinator of Multicultural Outreach for Credit Valley Conservation. Ashu has led the Multicultural Outreach program since its beginnings in 2009, and she's also led internal initiatives to foster intercultural discussions among staff and board members to enhance their understanding of diverse cultural perspectives, discuss racially and culturally sensitive issues, and build strategic policy frameworks to address anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ashu will be speaking about the programs and initiatives that Credit Valley Conservation and other conservation authorities have successfully implemented to address these important issues. Welcome, Ashu, and over to you.
And that means that we are seeing some largest visible minority groups in our watersheds, such as South Asians, Chinese, and Black communities. We're also seeing growing multilingualism in Greater Toronto area, with more than 45% of the population speaking non-official languages at home. The programs and services that conservation authorities offer in our watersheds are demographic driven, and this ethnic shift in our communities definitely has warranted us to give some new outlooks to our programs and services, and definitely think about out-of-the-box solutions to engage our new and growing demographic base. So I will start with some of the initiatives that Credit Valley Conservation has taken over the years um, to address and to incorporate DEIR, the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Racism initiatives. So CVC's first response to the changing demographics in our watershed was to start a multicultural outreach program in 2009 to engage ethnically diverse community members in environmental programs. To do this, developing relationships with organizations that work with immigrants was extremely fundamental in launching this program in the communities that did not know CVC at all. When I would go and talk to these organizations, Credit Valley as a name would resonate more as a hospital rather than a conservation sector organization. So some of the agencies that we early on engaged with was the settlement agencies that work with newcomers, schools that offer English as a second language programs for adult learners, the libraries, senior clubs, and many such organizations. So one of the first dilemma that we had was how to engage this diverse ethnic base in our watershed with nature. So for new Canadians, city parks are sold tickets for experiencing nature. So urban parks, no problem. On any given summer weekend, these places are full of people from diverse cultures enjoying barbecue picnics with family and friends outdoors. But when it comes to natural areas, our conservation areas, the story is very different. These are very alien concepts for new Canadians or immigrants, even if they are living in our watersheds for more than 10, 20 years. Early on, we realized that there are many barriers that these community groups face in accessing natural areas, and we tried to address some of those. But before we move further, let's look at some of these barriers. What are some of these barriers that people from ethnic backgrounds face? And one of the first one is the lack of awareness. So immigrants making home in Canada often do not have much awareness about local natural areas. In most instances, in my experience, their first choice for a natural area destination is Niagara Falls. I'm an immigrant myself, and in my own experience, I know that whenever I'm trying to arrange a picnic or an outing with my friends and their families, their popular destination is Niagara Falls most of the time. Even me advocating how much fun we could have in a local natural area, they would always want to go to Niagara Falls. And that's primarily because of the fact that they don't understand or they don't to what to do in a conservation area. The next big barrier is language. Language is a challenge for many newcomers who are coming and settling in our watersheds. In a typical newcomer household, a 10 to 12-year-old is the family's best interpreter we have. So when we are making our marketing tools or our communication tools, this barrier is a very important one to address. Otherwise, we lose the connection with our potential audience. Another barrier is transportation. Transportation is a huge issue for immigrants in accessing conservation areas because most of our conservation areas are not connected by transit. They're outside the urban belt, and that makes it more challenging for people to access nature in these areas. A typical immigrant takes about 2 to 3 years before they are able to get a car to roam around. So keeping this barrier in mind is also important. The next one is the fear for natural areas. People have inherent fears about being alone in outdoor natural spaces. In many cultures and geographies, going alone in natural areas is a big no-no because of the prevalent perception that these areas are associated with crime. Many people who are making home in Ontario are refugees coming from war-torn areas, and natural spaces like our conservation areas might remind them of bad memories. Social and cultural norms. These are also some reasons that can restrict people's ability to participate in our programs if we are not cognizant about them. For instance, if you're if you're planning for a natural hike or a tree planting event in the month of Ramadan when people fast all day, um, without any food or drink, it'll become very difficult for those participants to come and engage in your programs. So, keeping in mind the social cultural norms and the religious obligations that people from ethnic backgrounds might have is also a very important consideration in planning and removing these barriers. So now we've looked at some of the main barriers that ethnic communities face. Now let's look at how did we try to address this through our programs. So some of the lessons that we had learned over the years is to provide programs that are language appropriate, not scientific in nature, fit into the cultural norms of the population that you're engaging. They should be sensitive to the religious and the cultural needs of your population base. They should be senior inclusive programming. If possible, trying to not include transportation costs, gate fees, park fees, and providing a social environment in our parks so that these people can come and create positive memories that they can remember. For many of these people, this might be their first and might be their only chance to be outdoor in our natural areas. So, creating that social environment where they can enjoy the natural areas in the known company of their networks is very, very critical. So, with all this understanding, the Multicultural Outreach Program at CVC has been able to attract and engage of over 30,000 participants from diverse and marginalized communities over the last 11 years. We have been seeing an ever increasing demand for our programs. We are building new and non traditional partnerships. There's an immense sense of gratitude that we experience in our participants after attending our experiential programs. There's greater appreciation for natural areas, and people are able to overcome fear for natural spaces because when they come bust full load of their friends and family, they really have a great time in our parks. While this was taking place and our multicultural program was growing, CVC had taken some internal initiatives to address diversity and inclusiveness. And one of the first steps that internally we took was a creation of the CVC Diversity Committee in 2014. This committee was created to foster inclusiveness and equity at CVC through intercultural discussion and awareness. Also to make recommendations that will enhance CVC's programs and services both internally and externally, reflecting the full diversity of our watershed communities, and to enhance understanding on culture, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, ability, sexual orientation, and diverse culture perspectives by delivering lunch and learns, writing different articles for staff to build their awareness, inviting guest speakers, creating space for meditation and prayer room at our head office, and hosting pride flag at our head office and conservation areas are some of the ways that we have tried to build this awareness for our staff. Another big achievement was resonating the same messaging for diversity, equity, and inclusion through our strategic plan and corporate values and behaviors, because this was another reinforcement that these have great value in the work that we do at CVC. In 2019, CVC endorsed and adopted the Diversity and Inclusion Charter of Peel. Rooted in the values of our strategic plan, CVC has adopted 12 commitments to foster inclusiveness and equity at CVC. In June of 2020, as a response to the Black Lives Movement, the CVC Diversity Committee hosted a virtual event for the CVC staff to come together to share, hear, learn, recognize, and endorse a collective voice for Black Lives Matter and fight anti-racism at all levels. As a result of this event, on recommendations from our senior leadership, we established an anti-racism advisory committee to specifically address these issues within CVC. Another big achievement for CVC is the Credit Valley plan, Credit Valley Trail Indigenous Experience Implementation Plan that came together in 2020. The Credit Valley Trail strategy provides a number of strategies and directions for Indigenous engagement in our programs and services, and one of which is to share the cultures, traditions, history, and aspirations of Indigenous partners. Very recently, CVC, I think a week back, we issued and released the Corporate Diversity and Inclusion Statement on social media platforms, again, reinforcing that as an organization, we have ingrained a culture that promotes diversity, inclusion, and equity, and we stand tall against all kinds of racism. Now, all this great work that I just shared with you was not possible without the buy-ins of our senior management. So at Credit Valley Conservation, our senior leadership had a vision and inspiration to embrace diversity and inclusion both internally and externally through our programs and practices. We had the support of our management to engage non-traditional clients, people who did not know the name of the river that flows behind their homes is the credit. They were not shy away from piloting unconventional programs such as offering diabetes awareness workshops in conservation areas. They were very excited to explore new partnerships and help create an atmosphere of openness and acceptance. And I cannot emphasize enough, you could have a really brilliant idea, but if you will not have the will and the support of your senior leadership, those ideas get tabled all the time. So I feel that at CVC, we are very fortunate that we have a culture to embrace and address issues related to DEIR. Now I'm going to quickly go over some of the other examples that conservation authorities elsewhere have been adopting in their work and in their watersheds. So the first I'm going to talk about the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. TRCA has a program called Multicultural Connections Program, which was launched in 1997, way before Credit Valley Conservation had started its multicultural program. And this was first of its kind, and it was again rooted in very similar values as the ones that I had shared in the beginning, and was there to address the barriers that the ethnic diverse communities face in accessing nature. To help address these barriers, the Multicultural Connection program offers newcomers in-class environmental educational programs at their English as a second language centers by also providing subsidized buses for ESL field trips and by attending cultural and faith events in the community. Another program that TRCA offers is the Professional Access into Employment, which is the PAY program. Now, this program is an innovative bridge training program that helps internationally trained environmental professionals launch their careers in engineering, geoscience, environmental science, and planning. This program has been running since 2006, and it empowers participants with an increased understanding of the local labor market. Another program that TRCA offers is the Newcomer Youth Green Economy Project. This is an initiative that helps to support newcomer youth interested in careers in environmental sector by providing access to field trips, experiential learning, and job skills training. Another conservation authority that is spearheading some of these initiatives is the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. They're providing accessible trails and wheelchair accessible platforms at their conservation areas. Their Ballsview Fall Playscape program is intended to be inclusionary. They are working in consultation with their indigenous communities and having their representation on advisory committees. Their foundation has been providing day camp subsidy to low-income families in 2018 and 2019. They're also offering subsidized school programs for low-income neighborhood schools so that people with racialized backgrounds and communities could also come and attend such powerful programs that they're offering. And the Catfish Creek Conservation Authority has recently developed a partnership with YWCA Newcomer Youth Club program. This is a local partnership which is stemming out of their newcomer settlement program, and they are providing opportunities for the newcomer kids to experience nature through outdoor recreational programs and volunteer engagement programs. Now, I cannot emphasize enough the significance of such local partnerships that conservation authorities and other environmental organizations can develop to engage and to provide these experiential nature-oriented programs to the communities that the community organizations like YWCA are trying to look for their clients. So it's a partnership that can go a really long way in building a very strong connection for the newcomers who are coming and settling in our watersheds with nature. With that, I hope that I have inspired you all today to incorporate DEIR initiatives in the work that you are doing in whichever sector you are coming from. And if you have any further questions for me to elaborate upon, I will be very happy to connect with you in future. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ashu. Thank you for sharing those experiences both from CVC and the programs of some of the other conservation authorities. I'm looking forward to touching on some of the questions that I see coming in on the Q&A box a little later on. Our next presenter is Rhiannon Curtin, a Master's of Science candidate in Geography at Western University, who holds a BSc in Zoology from the University of Manchester. Rhiannon is currently studying white-tailed deer interactions with hunters. As a woman of color, she's witnessed the different experiences of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in both natural spaces and the conservation profession. Rhiannon is working to make these spaces more diverse and inclusive by organizing Black Birders Week and co-founding Black Mammalogists Week. Rhiannon will explain some of the barriers that the BIPOC community faces when recreating in the outdoors and in choosing conservation as a career path, and will illuminate some of the ways we can break down barriers so nature truly can be enjoyed by all of us. Welcome, Rhiannon, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Hi, everybody. My name is Rhiannon, and I am going to be sharing with you today some of my personal experiences and observations in this field of conservation and natural resource management. As Janet said, I'm a student. I'm not a DEI expert, but I can tell you about the things I've experienced and the discussions that we've had in our community as students of color, specifically Black students in the last year or so, but also just more broadly. So I will share this with you. If that would start, that'd be helpful. So this is me. All of these pictures you're going to see right now are of me, but this is me hiking actually in Algonquin this September just gone. I went on my first solo backpack, and this is me at my friend's bison farm. And so one of the biggest barriers that we see often and talk about often is the lack of representation for BIPOC people in the outdoors and in conservation. So you often don't see in advertising for outdoor companies, for conservation organizations, people of color and Black people in their marketing, in their advertising and that sort of thing. You have to see it to dream it. And so if you're not seeing people who look like you, often students don't actually know that these things are possible for them. So lots of Black students will not see themselves in a profession and they don't necessarily think of it as an option. So representation is a really big barrier. And I know some veterinary students at Guelph just set up a Black veterinarians network for that specific reason, that they felt that there wasn't enough representation of Black faces in the veterinary profession, and it's something that then causes people to not go into the profession because they don't see themselves in it. So representation is really important, and it's probably one of the easier things to rectify in some aspects, because there are diverse people who work in conservation. And this narrative that we construct is not always actually reflective of the people who work in the field. The fact that MEC or Patagonia or whoever else have all of these pictures of white, blonde, blue-eyed, thin little women hiking mountains all the time, and like that's the representation that we see for the outdoors, is not actually reflective of the outdoor community. So I think that's really important, is that your marketing and your advertising for things needs to actually represent the people who are already there. And then there's also the issue of there are less diverse people in these fields, and how can we change that? But I think a really great place to start is actually just being honest about the diversity that already exists. And so there are multiple different barriers to entering the conservation profession as a Black student or as a student of color. I am Black. I can't speak for people who are immigrants from non-English speaking countries that are not Black. I can't speak for Black people who are from non-English speaking countries. I'm from the UK. I spent time growing up in Australia. And so I'm at an advantage already in that I speak the language that is spoken here. I don't speak French though, but for me, it's not difficult for me to understand the signs and things that Ashu was talking about. So this is a really multifaceted problem. And often you see with diversity initiatives that they are grouping together BIPOC, and they're not actually paying attention to the individual communities within that acronym. The Black community, the Indigenous community, and other people of color all have different experiences and different barriers to their participation, and they're not necessarily going to be the same. So you have to be really aware of that. And you might have a program that works and attracts people to participate in it from Southeast Asia, but you might not get the Black community to participate. Or you might have something that works for Black and people of color, but not the Indigenous community. We're all very different, even though we all face systemic barriers. So I think that's also something really important to keep in mind when we're talking about these sorts of issues. And so obviously these are some really simple ideas about barriers to participation. Wealth in conservation is a huge, huge barrier, which is not to say that every BIPOC person comes from a disadvantaged background, but statistically speaking, those who are from marginalized backgrounds are less likely to be wealthy. And that's a huge problem in conservation, because to enter this field, you need to have money to access the kinds of opportunities that typically give you the skills you need to be successful in conservation. And I come from a zoology background. I work with mammals primarily. And so you get a lot of these opportunities in conservation that are pay to play. You need to get field skills, to go to university, to do all these other things. And you have to pay to volunteer. This is a terrible, terrible, terrible practice that we need to get rid of. Having people volunteer for long amounts of time is already problematic, but having people pay to volunteer just needs to be done away with. There's tons of literature on this subject about how it's harmful to our field to have these pay-to-play opportunities and to have so much of the work that happens in conservation be reliant on volunteers. And as an example for you, I went to school with lots of students who their parents could just pay for them to go to Africa, to volunteer on safari and gain skills. People from marginalized backgrounds often don't have the money to do that. And also it may not be safe for them to do that, depending on where these opportunities are. If you are a white student traveling globally and you have money, then you're probably pretty safe. But for BIPOC communities, there's a lot more things to think about besides even the wealth in terms of accessing these sorts of opportunities. And so it really then comes down to your success being reliant on you having the opportunity to do all of these experiences, which just furthers the inequities that we see in the conservation community in terms of who ends up being successful. That's me trapping a Tasmanian devil, as you can see there. And I went for 2 weeks to Tasmania when I lived in Melbourne. I was hugely fortunate to be able to do that. And I was working 2 jobs in Melbourne at the time to save up for grad school. And so there's lots of different ways in which wealth can be a barrier. It's not just about not having the money. It's also about, like, if you're working 2 jobs while you're in school, you're not going to have the same educational experience as someone who's not having to work while they're in school. Other things that are barriers, I know specifically in Ontario, there's a lot of streaming in schools and kind of guiding students of colour or from less wealthy backgrounds away from science and things like that due to systemic ideas and systemic racism in the system about the abilities of students of colour and things like that. And again, another issue that is a huge barrier is actually, even if you can afford to do XYZ activity, being able to afford the gear to do it is also another huge barrier. Often these kind of volunteering positions or even very junior positions require you to have hiking boots and waders and all these other pieces of equipment, gaiters, waterproof trousers, tons and tons of things that cost a lot of money. So that's another barrier as well, both in conservation and in outdoor recreation, is people being able to afford the gear they need to be outside safely. So this is another really important thing that I wanted to touch on during my talk, was this historical context. And that is something that I've talked about a lot because I study hunting, is this idea that, like, well, why can't Black people just go outside? They can just go outside like the rest of us. Why don't they hunt? Why don't they do this and that? But there's a lot of historical context, especially in North America, for Black people that might stop them from going outside. And this is something that I was thinking about yesterday on Martin Luther King Day, is that there's often a whitewashing of history and an erasure of Black people in outdoor spaces. All the quotes that I saw yesterday about Martin Luther King were lovely, but they were very palatable messages about what he believed in and unity and the only way out of darkness is light, which are not really true to his messages. He was a revolutionary, and if he were alive today, his message would probably be seen as divisive. But because he passed away and he was assassinated, we should not forget that, because he was hated at the time of his death, we now have all these kind of cherry-picked quotes that say that he wants us to be united and all these other things. And that's also true for a lot of outdoor spaces. There's kind of this narrative that the outdoors is very white, but historically Black people have been cowboys. Black people have lived on the prairies in Saskatchewan, but that's not the narrative that we commonly tell. So even where there have historically been Black people in Canada in the outdoors, it's not their stories we're telling. And so that further alienates people from seeing themselves in these spaces when actually we could be highlighting those people. There's also a lot of issues around gun culture, hunting. If you're a Black person, do you want to be outdoors with people who have guns? Because of the historical context of this continent. And something that we often say is that we are stolen people on stolen land. North America was built off of the backs of slaves on land stolen from Indigenous people. And that's something that we think about often. So I'm going to keep going here. I could talk about this all day. So something that's also really important is that often we focus our efforts on postgrad or on university students, but you have to start much younger. There's already a very small percentage of students who make it to university or who make it to the postgraduate stage. You need to start with the elementary children, with the high school children, because there's leakage throughout the whole pipeline. So it needs to be something that is at every single stage to make sure that people actually make it to postgraduate, to professional work, that sort of thing. Focusing our efforts just on undergraduates, as we often do, misses out a whole bunch of people who have kind of fallen off the pipeline along the way. So that's something that we've talked about a lot, is how do we encourage more children to enter the field, to stay in sciences. And it goes back to all of those other things like streaming and skills opportunities that are pay to play. There's so many different things along the way that stop people from even reaching the undergraduate or graduate stage. So the ideas that we've been working on for change are a multitude of things. So as Janet said, I was a founder of Black Mammalogists Week. And so one of the things that we're working on with the American Society of Mammalogists is establishing a scholarship that will allow students and high school students too to be able to apply to this scholarship and be able to use it for professional development. So if they need to go on a course that they have to pay for, if they have to take wilderness first aid, that sort of thing, they'll be able to apply for this scholarship, and that will allow them hopefully to offset some of the costs that are a barrier to gaining that professional skill set and those experiences that they need to be successful in the field of mammalogy and more widely conservation. And so we're really excited about that. Something else that we're working on, some students at Dalhousie, they set up something called Diversity in Nature, and it's going to be a free field course for BIPOC students by BIPOC grad students, which serves two purposes: for them to gain skills at a low cost, and also for them to see themselves as graduate students and as professionals in this field. So that's really exciting that they're doing that. They crowdfunded the money for that, and it will be going ahead post-COVID. So some other students of colour and I decided that we wanted to do something similar in Ontario, and we're currently putting together a proposal to run a similar field course by BIPOC grad students for BIPOC undergrads in Algonquin. So that's something that we're working on, is providing these opportunities at low or no cost to BIPOC students to remove some of those barriers to gaining skills that would otherwise cost a heck of a lot of money. And so the other thing that I have been working on is something called Kaleidoscope Canada. And so there's lots of these events that people ask, do you know someone who could speak at this? Can you share this to your network? And so I'm building right now a website, Kaleidoscope Canada, which is going to function as a network, a directory of BIPOC people who have a professional connection to nature, whether that be you're a natural scientist, or if you're a forester, if you work for a conservation authority, if you work in outdoor recreation, all of those sorts of professionals, hopefully in one place across Canada, because these conversations I found are very US centric, and Canada is not the USA. So it's really important to me that we have this space for BIPOC professionals in nature in Canada specifically to be able to connect with each other. So I'm working on that. And then some other initiatives that I wanted to mention because I think they're really important. They're not directly related to conservation, but they are in that they're exposing people to nature and the outdoor space, is Brown Girl Outdoor World, run by Demisha Dennis. She's in Toronto. And Color the Trails, which is run by Judith Kasiyama in Vancouver. And so what both of these groups do is offer low cost opportunities for people to get outside and learn from the BIPOC community about different outdoor recreation, camping, stand-up paddleboarding, mountain biking, skiing, a lot of those spaces where we often don't see BIPOC members of the community outside, they're working to change that. So that's something that I wanted to mention, and I see Janet down there in the corner. So I'm glad that I managed to finish this on time. But yeah, I hope that this has given you an insight into the many different barriers that we face and the things that we are doing as a community to try to change this, to get more BIPOC people outdoors and into conservation. And I think it's just really important that people like you support these initiatives and also invite people to talk about their areas of expertise. But thank you all very much. I will go in the chat box and try and answer some of your questions. But yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to the rest of the talks.
Thank you, Rhiannon, for sharing your experiences, for teaching us a little bit more about the challenges that you have experienced and have seen, and particularly in sharing those ideas for change. So as a reminder to all participants, if you have a question for any of our presenters, please at any time enter it into the Q&A box accessible in the bottom panel bar. And if a question that someone has already posted resonates with you, hit the thumbs up button to help us identify those questions that you'd most like us to address during this discussion period at the end. Our next speaker is Mark Peacock. Mark is the CAO and Secretary Treasurer of the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority. And in this position, he helps guide the authority and also continues to provide technical support to the water management services programs. Mark has over 30 years of experience developing and working with floodplain mapping and watershed management projects, including a recent collaboration with the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation to build flood forecasting models that incorporate both Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And this is the subject of his talk today. Thank you for joining us today, Mark. Over to you.
I think we've got it. I'll just, I think I have to switch my screen here. Screen sharing. There. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, and I'm Mark Peacock from the Lower Thames Conservation Authority. I'd like to talk a little bit about today about the experiences where we have with First Nations, give you some ideas of what we've learned, give you some examples of where we go. One of the things is that as conservation authorities, we do tend to look at our watersheds in many ways the same way First Nations do. And the square boundaries of municipalities are different than many of the understandings. And one of the things that a couple of years ago, I had a talk with one of the clan mothers of the Oneida Nation in our watershed. And we were talking about the spirit of water and the spirit of the understanding of nature. And she said, you know, maybe you people have just forgotten it, but I think all cultures have that in them and they just need to relearn it. And maybe I'm relearning that. Here's our watershed within the Lake Erie watershed and the watershed of the Lower Thames. There are 4 nations within the area we call the Lower Thames watershed: the Moravian Town Delaware Nation, the Munsee Delaware Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. But there are also a number of other nations that have relationships with our watershed, such as Caldwell and many others. The river name, the name that has been used, Thames River, is only a relatively short term name for that. The Deshkun-Zibi name of the river is a much longer definition or term for that river. There's about 600,000 people living in it, and a lot of rare species, a lot of very interesting things. The area has been very, very significantly developed, particularly in agriculture. In the Southwest, we have a range of 1.5% forest cover to 15%, and we have our problems. We have sediment in the system, we have phosphorus. There's a lot of work to do in the Thames River. We want to, through work with the landowners, including First Nations, reduce phosphorus by an overall 40% and spring totals and soluble reactive phosphorus also by 40%. It's a difficult task. It's something that we're going to take a long time, and we're going to have to engage a lot of people, because most of the loading comes from non-point sources, and out of that, 82% of the land use is agriculture. So many people involved in doing this. I want to show you this map. All the green that you can see is the forest covering our watershed. So you can see the challenge we have as we move forward. We have other challenges, other problems, such as flooding, massive flooding issues throughout the watershed, that only working with everybody and partnering in stewardship and in water management, we can gain this. So how do we move about it? How do we change things? We partner, and we accept that there is change ahead. And one of the more important partners in our watershed are our First Nations. So why should we work with First Nations? Well, there's an awful lot of them. They represent a huge amount of land. They represent a huge amount of people. They also have many of the goals and beliefs that we have as conservation authorities when it comes to watershed management and natural resources. They help us think broader in the way we do our work. There's lots of grants, lots of applications, lots of programs that we can share with First Nations that help us in our work. How do we build those relationships? We start with respect. We attend when we're invited. We attend events that the nations are holding, and we invite those nations to our events as well. There's a picture up at the top of this slide of Kelly Riley, who is the environmental program or environmental division leader at the Chippewas of the Thames, and he's speaking at our annual general meeting. The picture below them is the recognition by the Lower Thames Conservation Authority of the Chippewas of the Thames, because they are really leadership people and innovators in environment in our watershed. We work with these nations, the foreign and other nations, foreign nations and other nations around us to put together grant opportunities, to create workshops, to do all kinds of work with regards to delivering our environmental message. One of the things that we also do is we provide free permits for all First Nations peoples of our watershed to access our conservation areas. So there's a lot of things that we can work together, and building relationships is important. But these things do take time. They have to be built on trust, and we have to understand that there is a different system in play in the First Nations, not only the political system, but their funding and the way they do their work. So we try to just get the work done. We can get bound up in a lot of jurisdictional and boundary issues and everything else, but in the end, the important thing is to do work. This is just an example of some of the many grant programs that we work with First Nations on, and they are significant in our programming. One of the things that we have the privilege of is hosting a reconstructed Haudenosaunee village at one of our conservation areas, the Skanderdaw Village. There are 3 longhouses and a number of other facilities. It has been a partnership with the First Nations of our area for many, many years, and many people work on it. And in the last couple of years, we've had work crews both from the Chippewa Thames and then Oneida Nation of the Thames rebuilding those structures. As part of the Skanderdaw Village program, we want to take action with regards to truth and reconciliation. And one of the things that important to know about the Skanderdaw area is that there are a lot of artifacts, and the Skanderdaw Village came about because of an archaeological dig. Those artifacts and many others are there through the use of that land over many, many years by Indigenous peoples. And from what we're doing most recently is we're producing curriculum for both grade 3s and 5s, and we are returning a certain number of those artifacts to the communities through their schools for learning opportunities. The picture below here is a First Nations assistant curator, Leanne Doxeter, working on delivering those elements. But what I'm doing, I'm going to give you 2 different nations we work with, just because there's only so much time, and I want to focus on some of the work. And one of the people that we work with a lot is Darren Jacobs out of the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown. And he has been working with us over the years, sampling water. He was employed with us to do water sampling of 10 different wetlands. And he's coordinated a lot of work in restoration, including restoration of 15 acres of Carolinian trees. One of the other programs that we work with the Delaware Nation on is the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk. A significant amount of work has gone on through that. There was a $50,000 grant, 2 First Nations staff at Delaware employed. And there was a lot of work, not only with the Delaware Nation, but other peoples coming in to help with things such as river cleanups, tree plantings, erosion projects. And there's a picture below of staff and family members from Union Gas helping out within the Delaware Nation with Delaware community members. Another project with this was to look at what was in the river, to look at IDing mussels. One of the things about the Thames River, there are significant mussel populations that are found only in this area, and it's a significant environmental resource for our watershed. We had a First Nations mussel ID course that we partnered with GFO on, and a significant amount of learning went on with First Nations people about what the resources had. And this is once again from a science perspective. Want to bring another person, Bruce Stonefish, the founder of Mising, and he's working with a number of people in the Delaware Nation in a committee to and actually an organization to lead in the protection and the restoration of the watershed in that area. They've raised significant amount of money over many years to do restoration work in the Delaware Nation. Another example is conserving the landscape, the Chippewa, the Thames, the Deshkun-Zibi Agricultural Management Plan. Many First Nations have a certain amount of land that they rent to agricultural operations, and they want to look at that and do a better job of protecting the watershed and addressing runoff issues and those types of things through the development of an agricultural management plan. And the Conservation Authority is providing work support regarding monitoring, watershed management, and BMP issues. There are very many, as I said before, the Chippewa, the Thames are leaders in the environment, and many of the programs are being undertaken by their community, and we're just providing some support. The final project I want to talk about is the floodplain mapping project that we're working with Chippewas of the Thames and the other nations to a certain extent, but the real leaders are the Chippewas of the Thames. These are the partners. I think it's important to list your partners because your project's only as good as your partners, and we have some great partners in this project. So the main components of the partnership is, there are 3 or 4 things here, but the key here to remember is we're trying to have a project that marries traditional knowledge with Western science. So how do we do that? How do we bring the community understandings into a program? How do we bring the spirit of the water into what we're trying to achieve? So part of that is communications. Cofton is the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation, is leading this with a liaison person and an advisory committee. The Conservation Authority is leading with the technical work as we develop tools for the community and try to make sure that the traditional knowledge is respected in that work. One of the ways we're doing this is developing workshops for the community that are being taped so they can be used across Canada for other First Nations, and they work their way through the project. But once again, even though these titles are technical, there is a significant element of these workshops that are traditional knowledge and based learnings. So we go all the way through the different technical parts, but once again, we're trying to get a completed floodplain mapping that includes the community and its understanding of water. I think Emma will talk a little bit about this. It's quite interesting that the First Nation has an understanding of floodplains. There aren't people in the floodplain because they understand that it floods. It's too bad we can't say that about all our communities in Southern Ontario. But very, very interesting work, and there's a significant amount of flooding in the nation. These are the technical elements that the Conservation Authority is leading. We're doing it internally, but we are using third-party peer reviewers made up of a number of experts in the area and a peer review committee to make sure that we do this work properly. So hydrology, hydraulics, floodplain mapping, and risk assessment. The risk assessment being very important, that we look at all the different risks that are associated with flooding, not only flooding from experiences that we now have, but also flooding from potential climate change experiences. And we provide advice on actions that the nation could take if they wished to address this. And once again, it is the First Nation that is leading this. We are just providing the technical elements to it. So what do we hope to have out of this project? We want a floodplain mapping for the Chippewas of the Thames that's updated and that considers climate change. We want to allow the community to make to consider decisions that will create sustainability, and we want to build capacity in the community. And hopefully, the curriculum that we create through our workshops can be used across Canada in watershed management and in floodplain mapping. We want to encourage other people and other nations to enter into partnerships like this and develop new relationships. And we want to create momentum for success in the future. So most important, we need to, as conservation authorities, partner with First Nations, and it must be on their terms. We need to work with First Nations to take action in the environment, and we need to do that locally. Because we're all just turtles on the same log, and we need to share the water and we need to take action in a shared waters way. One of the things I'm going to leave you with is this concept is a concept that we call co-management. And I think that it's imperative that we start thinking about our river systems and our First Nations in a co-management way. So that's something I would like to leave with you. Thank you. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Mark. That was a great overview of some of the work of your partners and of Lower Thames. I'm particularly interested to see the application of new approaches to traditional conservation authority projects like floodplain mapping. Next, we'll be hearing from Emma Young. Emma is a senior environmental officer with the Chippewas of the Thames First Nations. Emma joined the treaty Lands and Environment team in 2017. She's currently completing a Master of Arts in Geography from the University of Toronto, focusing on Deshkan Zibi, the Thames River, and documenting community knowledge and stories of the river as a means of empowering Deshkan Zibing, the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, to reimagine a future for the river outside of the predominant colonial narrative. Emma will give us an overview of the environmental responsibilities of the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation and how they care for water in what's now known as Southwestern Ontario. And we'll highlight the success the nation has had in leveraging relationships to influence local water-related decision-making, including the floodplain mapping project with the Lower Thames Valley that Mark mentioned. Welcome, Emma. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Just gonna get my presentation going. Good. So as mentioned, my name is Emma Young, and I work for Chippewas of the Thames First Nation as the Senior Environment Officer. My presentation today is titled Deshkan Zibi, a shared river, with Deshkan Zibi being an Anishinaabe-Moan, and it's what we use for the Thames River, and it means antler or horned river. My presentation, it is linked to Mark's from the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority. However, I'll be providing a little bit more insight into Chippewa's perspective and involvement on the project. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I will be talking about Chippewas of the Thames First Nation and our interest in conservation and the environment. I just want to have a quick discussion on what is meant by water and what do we mean by water. And lastly, I'll just overview our floodplain mapping project with the LTVCA and how we've gotten to the point of working collaboratively with them. So Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. So Chippewas of the Thames First Nation is a First Nations community located approximately 20 kilometers southwest and downstream of London. And we're on the north banks of the Thames River. We are signatory to several pre-Confederation treaties, meaning that these treaties were signed before Canada became a country, and so they're signed with the British Crown. And the large image on the left is a map showing our treaty and traditional territory. And so we have the McKee Treaty along the bottom along Lake Erie in that pinky orange color, and that was signed in 1790. We have the Sombra Treaty on the left, it's the light green, that was signed in 1796. Also signed in 1796 was the London Township Treaty, it's that blue, the darker one above the lime green. And that lime green rectangle is the Longwoods Treaty. And this treaty is significant for Chippewa as we are the sole signatories to this treaty, which is fairly unique in this area. And so that treaty, it did have a couple pre-confirmatory versions, but the confirmatory version of that was signed in 1822. And so we have also the red lines on this image, and that shows our traditional territory, which is much of Southern Ontario, and it would go into what is now Michigan and Ohio. And I think it's really important when talking about our treaty history to note that we signed these treaties, but we never gave up any rights or responsibilities to steward these lands and waters. And as you can see in this map, it does cover many watersheds. We have the Thames River, the Sydenham, Ausable, you have Lake St. Clair there, Lake Erie, Lake Huron. So this is crossing many different conservation authorities, different jurisdictions, but this is all within our territory. And I also have on this image a map of, or not a map, a flag, Chippewa's flag, and our local elementary school, Antler River. So I work out of the Treaty Lands and Environment Department. We are a relatively new department. Within the last 10 years, we've been up and running, and our work covers quite a large area, from land claims research to implementing the federally mandated duty to consult and accommodate, to environmental monitoring and land management, and everything and anything in between. But what really connects us all is the foundation of land and our responsibility to our treaty and traditional territory. And so my work, it involves working at the larger treaty and traditional territory level, also at the watershed level, and oftentimes at the community level where we're really able to do project implementation. And it should be noted that not all communities have the capacity for an environment department. We're quite lucky in Chippewa that the communities really made the environment a priority. And my position specifically is funded via a community benefit agreement that we have with the City of Toronto over a nearby landfill that they own. And these images on the screen, they're from the Stream of Dreams project. I'm sure many people are familiar. I think I saw Julie Welker in the chat. She was awesome. She really helped us in doing this at Antler River Elementary School. And that was a fun project. So some of the current projects we've undertaken in the realm of environment and conservation within the last 5 years include, we've been doing water monitoring in our local streams and the Thames River since 2015. We do fish monitoring every summer. We're currently piloting some phosphorus reduction technologies as a project with the Ontario Federation of Agriculture and the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. The image on the left is of a large farm field that we have in the community, and we planted 5 acres of prairie grass as part of the Alice project. So trying to reduce agricultural runoff, create some habitat, mitigate erosion that we have going on there. We've also protected 250 acres of land in Chippewa for the purpose of conservation and protection, which is pretty significant for this community considering the amount of acres we have and the different land use priorities. We also have done species at risk work. We've been trying to do an annual green powwow, so really reducing the amount of waste out of that annual event. We didn't have one this summer because of COVID, but it was online and it was still good. We do annual tree planting, which is that image Mark presented where we're holding a plaque was for some of our tree planting work. And we also have Antler River Guardians of the 4 Directions. And this project isn't specific to just Chippewa, although we do administer the program, but it's a really amazing youth environmental stewardship program that's available to First Nations youth in Southwestern Ontario. And this came through the Thames River Clearwater Revival. And it's really made possible and championed by all the project partners on that, which is that could be a whole separate presentation on really great collaboration and support. And these images is one of a summer student we had doing fish sampling, and we did a Thames River cleanup where we canoed down the river and tried to pick up garbage that was on the banks. And lastly, these are just some screenshots off of Google Maps. And the blue circle in both images is circling the Chippewa Reserve. And I think one thing that is quite obvious in both images is a large patch of green inside the circle compared to the surrounding land. And while in Chippewa, we do prioritize maintaining a healthy environment and creating a safe home for all beings, human and non-human, there are land pressure challenges that arise from operating within a confined land base. And primarily these challenges come from the need for additional homes and infrastructure as our population is continuing to increase, but our land base is not. However, we are actually in the middle of a community land use planning process, and through these engagements, the community has really made it clear that protecting the environment and providing housing are of equal and top priority. Okay, and so before I speak about our floodplain mapping project with the Lower Thames, I'm just going to begin with a bit more of a philosophical question and ask, what is water? And I'm just going to let you think about that on your own. And while I'm sure everyone's answers vary, it's likely many thought or they think of water from a more scientific or utilitarian perspective. And it really is this more colonial perception of water, which has really influenced much of, if not all, of the current approaches to water governance and management in Ontario today. And it is these colonial perceptions of water that are in direct contrast to how many Indigenous people view water. And this includes acknowledging water as a living being with spirit, and for the Anishinaabe, viewing water as the lifeblood of Mother Earth, with each creek, stream, river acting as one of her veins. And I bring this up because it's important to note that First Nations are often forced to work within these colonial definitions and frameworks if they want to participate or be a part of discussions of water governance in Ontario. And so when collaborative opportunities arise, it's really important to consider under whose narrative is this collaboration taking place, and how is this collaborative project designed to allow for equal footing for both Western science and Indigenous ways of knowing. And I've included here the Chiefs of Ontario Water Declaration. This is a declaration which I believe was drafted in 2008 during a water policy forum hosted by the Chiefs of Ontario and Garden River. And the declaration is essentially reaffirming First Nations in Ontario's responsibility to water. And I think it's important here to highlight, which was also included in this declaration, the special relationship between women and water. And while everyone has a responsibility to care for and respect water, women do have a special relationship and responsibility. And in the Anishinaabe tradition, women have a special relationship with water because, like Mother Earth, they both have life-giving powers. And for this reason, women are seen as caretakers of water. And because of this, I would argue that women really should have a special place in decision-making about water. But of course, as it currently stands, this link between women and water is ignored in current water decision-making processes. So for the last portion of my presentation, I'd like to focus on our collaborative floodplain mapping project with the LTVCA. And as Mark mentioned, there are several other groups involved in this project, such as Cambium Indigenous People Services, Green Communities Canada, Conservation Ontario, and the Canadian Environmental Law Association. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be focusing on our work with the LTVCA. So first, it is important to note that the Lower Thames watershed is located within Chippewa's treaty and traditional territory. And this includes the Longwoods Treaty, which, as I mentioned, Chippewa is a sole signatory to. And while we do exercise our rights and responsibilities to these lands and waters through avenues such as the duty to consult and accommodate, we do make an effort to pursue relationship building outside of this framework with various environmental actors in our territory. And so, building a positive working relationship with the Lower Thames, it has taken time. We've been working with Mark and his team for several years, and really we just invited them out to Chippewa for an introductory meeting where we could both just listen and share about our responsibilities to this watershed. And I think, as Mark mentioned, it became clear quite quickly that we all have common goals in really just wanting a healthy and thriving watershed. And I I do think we were fortunate to go through this process with the Lower Thames, as we weren't really in a position of having to convince them of our rights and responsibilities to this territory. And they really seemed to come to these meetings with a good heart and a good mind. And likewise, when they were talking to us about the work that they were undertaking, we were really excited and happy to see that that work was being done. And so it came from taking this time to lay the foundation of trust and mutual respect that we were able to progress and look towards mutually beneficial collaborative opportunities. And as Mark did mention also, our collaboration does go beyond this floodplain mapping project. They are providing a lot of support to us on our agricultural management plan. They're oftentimes offering species at risk assistance, or if we need help in environmental monitoring. And so I have also included here this image of the 7 grandfather teachings. And it was really through following these principles that we're able to have a good and a positive working relationship. And quickly, I do just want to explain why Chippewa is participating in this floodplain mapping project. This image is a historical map of the reserve from the late 1800s, I believe 1890. And the section circled in blue is the portion of the reserve that was surveyed out for band members where the Indian agent had intended for them to settle. So this is a more recent image from Google Earth, and the purple parcels of land circled in blue show the land that was circled in the previous image. And as you can see in this image, the primary land use on those parcels now is agriculture and woodlot, meaning, as Mark mentioned, Chippewas didn't settle here. And we didn't settle here because it's a floodplain. So our ancestors knew that settling on a floodplain was not a smart or good idea. And today we still don't have any homes or infrastructure within our floodplain. But with that being said, we do see value in participating in a floodplain mapping project. We don't currently have a comprehensive floodplain map. And with increasing land use pressures, such as an increasing demand for housing and the required infrastructure to support that, along with the uncertainty of climate change, having a floodplain map is beneficial for future land use planning decisions and for emergency preparedness. And we're also in a position where we need to make sure we're doing our due diligence today so that we're making wise decisions for the future generations. And this, I think Mark mentioned this also, but this project does have capacity building opportunities built into it, where Chippewa and the other First Nations communities, so Munsee, Delaware, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and Delaware Nation, are able to participate as they're able to in various training or online modules. Okay, so that was a quick snapshot of the work we're currently undertaking. I hope I was able to convey the responsibility that Chippewa has to care for our treaty and traditional territory, and that for meaningful collaboration to take place, it really takes time to build a relationship. And trust and understanding is key for positive collaboration. So miigwech for listening.
Thank you very much, Emma, for sharing with us the perspectives of your nation on water stewardship and the value of the partnerships and relationships you've formed with the Conservation Authority. Our final speaker is Nidhi Tandon. Nidhi is an independent international consultant and founder and director of Networked Intelligence for Development, an independent consulting practice focused on the intersection of healthy ecologies, human rights, and equitable community development, working from a strong gender justice platform. Nidhi sits on the board of Sustainability Network and is a past board member of Ontario Nature. Nidhi will be discussing how organizations are tackling some of these complex issues, both here in Canada and internationally, and how we might walk the talk on goals of inclusion in organizational culture, governance, and leadership. Welcome, Nidhi. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation on a lovely sunny-ish day. And very good to hear all the perspectives that were shared this morning. These are really very important conversations to be having during a very important time that has been sharpened in relief by this pandemic that continues to spread even as we speak, and that has exposed right across the globe almost a kind of apartheid as to who has been impacted the worst. In fact, even the rollout of the vaccines shows an inequity across countries and between nations. And that's why the work of conservation is so important, because the work that you are doing directly, programmatically in conserving the planet and our relationship with the planet should have a tidal wave effect on how we manage the zeitgeist of today, meaning we are at that time in history where we fully confront the legacy of recent history and post-colonialism and all its implications for the peoples of this planet. So I want to talk about the work that needs to happen at leadership level. Now, everybody so far has been talking about leadership in its many multi-forms, grassroots leadership, leadership through youth movements, leadership through programmatic partnerships, and leadership through telling the other story. These are all really important. And without them, we wouldn't be able to have these conversations. And my presentation will be more from an organizational leadership point of view. So please be patient with me. I'm not a conservation person. I am invited here, though, because I sit on the board of Sustainability Network and because the little work that I do in Canada is sitting on boards that have a planetary perspective. So I'll leave that as my opening, I think, and take you through a presentation that I had sort of prepared. I'm assuming you can all see okay, yes? To say that these are very complex issues, right? And when Janet opened up, in fact, she said, it's quite intimidating, and I agree. And so I thought I would share this, which is that oftentimes when we have had these kinds of conversations, we put the Chatham House rules in effect. And what are the Chatham House rules? It's another legacy of colonial history, but basically it's a set of rules that says we can have a free and open and trusted conversation without naming who said what very specifically. And so why is that important? Because this subject matter is intensely subjective and very much informed by our personal histories, identities, empathies, values. And it's no coincidence, actually, that a good number of the fantastic presenters we've been listening to actually straddle a number of cultures. It's those people who straddle cultures who are best able to build those kinds of bridges. But when I've done this kind of work, I always establish the Chatham House rules first, and I thought I would introduce that to everybody just as a way to suggest that creating that kind of safe space is really important. I remember when I came to this country, first of all, I was astonished how many times my children learned the history of the pioneer this and pioneer that, and very little about the First Peoples. And then I do recall there was a little Dutch girl sitting with my daughter, must have been grade 4 or something, and they were learning the history of South Africa and Nelson Mandela. And suddenly she burst out crying because she realized that the Boers were the ones who had established apartheid. And, you know, all of us parents gathered around to comfort her that it was not her to blame, but just to say that these are very sensitive issues and, as Janet said, intimidating. And we don't want them to be intimidating. We want them to be aspirational. And much of what everybody's been contributing today is very aspirational, while at the same time exposing some of our internal biases we don't even realize sometimes when we speak. I thought what I would do is give you some examples from my international development work, because that is really 99% of my work. And you may be comforted to know that we are all in good company. Even the United Nations Women just held a major series of very, very detailed internal examination of racism and discrimination within the UN. So just so you feel comfortable. In this little presentation I've prepared, I'm sort of looking at these issues from an individual leadership perspective to an institutional portfolio type perspective to building of a movement perspective. Oftentimes when we, delve into institutional leadership, we get stuck there. We start to look at, SWOT analysis and strategies and plans of actions and forget that actually we are part of a much larger movement, which is to shift away from history and create a new future. So let me just start with my ABC. And I start with this word ambition. And leadership, even though we've been talking mostly about grassroots leadership, Ashu actually did say, she said, without the will and support of our senior leadership, we wouldn't be able to do all the things we've been doing. And that's really profound. The flip side of the coin, of course, is that an enlightened leadership really helps to spearhead development further and faster. And I say this because in our work, we have been invited, for example, by quite enlightened organizations, by the way, who are working on, women's empowerment in international development, to conduct participatory gender audits, okay? And just to keep the story short, what tends to happen ultimately is it all roads lead to the board and senior management. Without that fundamental systemic shift, everything that you're doing remains at grassroots and programmatic. And as this particular organization that I have in mind, that's based here in Ontario and does work all across the African and Latin American continents, ultimately they realized we cannot preach equality and equity if we don't actually have that culture within our organization. So just to say, an enlightened agenda really rests with the board of directors and senior management, and they ultimately, working with everyone, will determine how ambitious the organization is, and as a result, have a direct impact on the movement. So I've just written here, broaden and deepen directors' commitment to diversity, social inclusion, gender equality through best governance practices. So this includes everything from HR, who you hire, who's representative on the board, which voices are missing and need to be brought around the table, etc., etc., etc. Introduce directors to the language, concepts, and frameworks in the DEIR arena. You'll be amazed. I was asked by the UN Convention on Biodiversity based in Montreal to come and do a little bit of training on actually mostly gender equality. But of course, I always use that as my entry point to talk about social inclusion and racism, discrimination, oppression, exploitation. And they didn't realize that they had opened a Pandora's box by inviting me in and eventually I ended up running a training workshop for the board, who initially, they're all scientists. Initially, one of them said to me, chief scientist said to me, you know, I don't understand what gender has to do with this. I'm a chief scientist. What do you want me to do? Count female trees and male trees? And I reminded them, you wouldn't need to have a UN Convention of Biodiversity if it wasn't for the fact that the planet has humans living on it. And it's the relationships between those humans that makes you have to enforce this UN Convention. Because, and I don't need to be telling all of us, we are losing biodiversity by the minute. And so running those kinds of trainings actually means enabling board members and senior management to embrace and engage with the language, concepts, and frameworks of DEIR. Otherwise, it mostly stays with grassroots. Grassroots does the leaning in, and leadership just continues with what they've been doing. And then the important piece, which is fostering dialogue and discussion. And here, I must say, I have had the honor and privilege of working with Sustainability Network, and I'll come to them towards the end of this little discussion. But very, very early on, Paul Bobelis, who's the ED of Sustainability Network, identified this gap that the environmental NGO movement here looked very homogeneous, and there was a problem. And in the work, in the dialogues and discussions that we facilitated through Sustainability Network, we found, in fact, a lot more similarities and linkages in understanding things like water and the living organism that water is, the preciousness of water and soil. So speaking to someone from Nepal and bringing this person together with a First Nations clans person, and they would marvel that in fact they shared a similar value. So these dialogues and discussions, if you brought diversity around the board and senior management, you would begin to see these synergies and these catalysts, and that determines ambition. Right? So I always try to say, are you just going for the low-hanging fruit? Things that look optically good, or are you prepared to do the really hard work to change the culture of your organization? How ambitious do you want to be? So that's the A. And the B is biases. We all have biases. I'll be the first to tell you that there are aspects of the way I was brought up that make me essentially racist. I'm by birth half Indian, half Chinese. I grew up in Africa till the age of 21. But I come from a British colonial background, and I know I have my racisms. Actually, it's against my own people. I'm very, very hard on mostly Indians and Chinese. That's the funny part. And it's because I know they're very racist against Africans. And I consider myself more African. So just to say, we come with our different biases and racisms that we pick up along the way because of how we're brought up and where we are. I'll stop there because I won't go into it too much more, just to say that in much of the training that we do with senior managers and board directors, they become surprised a little bit by their unconscious bias or by their paternalistic outlooks or by their assumptions. And having that kind of exercise is really good. You know why? Because it just puts everybody back into their humble shoes. And a little bit of humility shared around the table is a good thing. And so everybody stops a bit and says, oh yeah, that's true. When you do that little exercise and I have to choose a present for my niece, it'll be different than for my nephew. That's just a very simple example. But when we say that our ambition is to advance equity, to close inequality gaps, whether it's within our organization or within the conservation area that we're working in, we have to understand and accept the complexity of our varied histories. And as Ashu said, 250 ethnic groups coming into Ontario. That is a lot of different history and experience. We have to put all of that together into our organization's collective histories and experiences in order to build that movement. And this is really, really important because, as some people have already pointed out, it's not as if we're that different from the countries south of us. And I'm sure you're already aware of the growth, actually, I should say, of hate and superiority type movements here. So they're building a movement, that's the zeitgeist of the time and the backlash, and we have to build our movement. And then the C of the ABC is change, looking beyond the organization. And again, because I have an international development perspective that I'm bringing in here, you will most likely know that quite a few development organizations are looking at no longer working as an institution alone, but really crossing the river, as it were, to find that other organization that's doing something complementary and having a collective impact on that river, let's say, or the communities living along that river. And understanding that while we may be competing for resources or competing for markets, in fact, we're better off collaborating. And so a lot more language around multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. How do we break out of silos and create something new? And then just to say again, for those of you who may not be familiar, the Millennium Development Goals were a set of goals established to tackle poverty, inequity, and development. And subsequently, we have the Sustainable Development Goals established with an outcome for 2030, where for the first time, the agenda for life on oceans, for life on land, for climate action, for responsible consumption and production, for green industry, all of these aspects became part of Sustainable Development Goals. And every single country in the world is required to report against these, right? So Canada too. And so it gives us all a collective responsibility across the planet to be working together on these efforts. So just so you know, SDG 5 is about gender equality and equity. So when we have these dialogues and discussions, how do we approach them? There are three aspects I'm suggesting. One, and this word, in fact, culture, has been mentioned a few times by previous speakers, so that's always a good thing. But culture, what is the comfort zone of the culture we're prepared to lead in our organization? What does it look like? What kind of currency in our language? And again, this has been also mentioned by a couple of our previous speakers, the language that we use, the terminology, what's the social contract that we're aspiring to? How do we drive forward the norms of today for the norms of tomorrow? And what's the compass? What's the direction that we're looking at? And in order to reach that direction, what competencies do we need to put in place? So a tool that's been used often from a number of different kinds of organizations, and it's been established by the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and a couple of other institutions that are concerned about social equity, are participatory social audits. So these are, much as an organization may do a financial audit, you do a social audit. And how wide you make this audit depends really on how ambitious you are. So it could be only within the institution, or it could include the portfolio of programmatic actions that you have in play. And so you conduct your social audit with everybody that's included and excluded as a result of your work. And it's amazing the kinds of things that these audits expose. And that's when senior management and the board have to grapple with, okay, what is it we're prepared to actually handle? The zeitgeist in the corporate sector has been talking quite a bit about gender and racial diversity and its unique perspectives that comes to the boardroom. And a recent PricewaterhouseCoopers survey of nearly 900 directors said that 82% agreed that some diversity will enhance board performance, 59% tied it to better company performance, and 94% said gender and racial diversity is a good thing. And still, 16% said that that kind of diversity has no benefits at all. That's an important aspect to ensure that we tackle. And it's usually because people are saying, we don't want tokenism. We don't want to hire somebody who actually doesn't bring in value to the board. In fact, what I have found in my experience sitting on boards in this province is that if you don't look hard, you won't find. And so if your criteria isn't clear and you're not prepared to put in the legwork and tap the networks, you will not find the right people. And so we can't be lazy about that. And from a cultural point of view, let me just read a very small piece here. It says, from an organizational context, culture is reflected in policy and procedures and every level of the governance structure to buy into and live that culture. Very, very difficult. Easy to write about, very difficult to do, because it really means unpeeling layers of unconscious bias and discrimination and looking again at your policies to change them. And let me just give you an idea. The Green Climate Fund. I don't know if you know this fund, but it's a new fund. It's only about less than 10 years old. And it's an international climate fund. Canada is the donor, is one of the donors. And its primary aim is to provide grant and loan money to smaller developing countries to tackle climate change. Okay, that was a long sentence. And I was brought in to review their gender equality policy, which was very generic. It really didn't say very much at all, and it was mostly focused on women. So I worked with 3 cycles of stakeholders. This is global. So the stakeholders are donors, NGOs, and governments. 3 cycles of stakeholders, took 2 years, and used the gender policy to push the agenda for social inclusion. Because as we know, we have elite men and women, and we have poor men and women. So the whole intersectionality of inequity is what I was driving at. And then we have Indigenous peoples, migrant peoples, internally displaced peoples, people who have no say whatsoever. So imagine it went through 3 cycles, and it was a very powerful document ultimately, and I was flown back to South Korea to now present it to the board. And the board is made up, of course, of donor governments, representatives, and of course, they have a small set of other country stakeholders. And after, okay, so I should say the agenda before mine was the Indigenous Peoples' Rights policy. That went through. That went through amongst great applause. And then the gender equality and social inclusion policy was put up, and it was debated at length, and 3 board members did not allow it to go through. One was Saudi Arabia, one was Cuba, and the other was the United States, our dear neighbor down south. And it's because of some of the language that was in there that talks about rights. So just to say, it's not easy to change culture. And in this day and age, particularly when there is a backlash against rights, and as Rhiannon said very clearly, if Martin Luther King was here today, he would be saying some very strong things, which is why he's not here today. But in the US, we essentially have an apartheid culture, but nobody will call it that. But anyway, I digress. So here is a 2019 Russell Reynolds study on board culture and direct behaviors. And they talk about directors participating in a self-evaluation exercise and then discussing corporate culture. In fact, corporate culture is very rarely part of board agendas, and it should be made part of board agendas because it's a difficult discussion to have, and yet it is the fundamental foundation of that organization.
Perhaps on that thought, Nidhi, I'm going to suggest we shift into our open discussion time. There's some great
Yes.
questions coming in. You have a wealth of experience to share with us. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Can I ask all of the speaker panelists to please turn their videos back on, and we'll start to work our way through some of the questions that have been submitted. The first question is for Rhiannon. It says, I'm mindful of trying to avoid tokenism when portraying BIPOC members in marketing, social media, etc. Any thoughts about including diverse people in imagery, but trying to avoid shoving BIPOC participants to the front of the group picture?
I think this is something that has been talked about a lot, especially in the more like outdoor rec space of building lasting relationships with more diverse like outdoor rec people. So I think that is definitely true that you don't want tokenism, but that is also, I think, a really good point that Nidhi made, that you can establish relationships that are genuine and lasting with members of the BIPOC community who you would like to include in your marketing. It doesn't have to be tokenism if you're really willing to put in the work. And that's what we often see, is lots of people invite people to talk or like put them in their pictures or whatever, but they don't establish a lasting relationship. And I know that's something that lots of outdoor companies are working on. But I would also say, you know, it's not tokenism if you have someone who is a BIPOC member of staff in your organization to include them, because they already work within. So finding people who are already there is also really important.
Thank you, Rhiannon, for that. A couple of questions for Ashu. One is, how did CVC align their diversity and inclusion objectives into their strategic plan? What kind of objectives and activities did they identify?
So I'll just share some of the embedded objectives in our strategic plan that are giving us direction for diversity and inclusion. So build capacity for our education programs to increase environmental literacy among youth, adults, and new Canadians. Work with the priority communities to address local environmental concerns through targeted outreach and action. develop and maintain trail systems and accessible options within our conservation areas that connect to other trail systems and features of historic, cultural, and environmental importance, creating a healthy, safe, respectful, accessible, and inclusive work environment. Train and mentor youth, students, and new Canadians to provide valuable work experience and to promote green economy. For the Indigenous people, we are committed to partnering with the Indigenous nations, communities, and peoples to advance reconciliation through our work and practices. And for our staff, we support, engage, and develop our people, fostering a culture of inclusiveness, health and safety, well-being, excellence, and leadership. So these are some of the directions that we get from our strategic plan. We also have a document that guide our work, which is our values and behavior, our corporate values and behavior. Inclusiveness is one of the values that we nurture in our corporate culture. So I think it's a group of all these that give us much meaningful direction in our work every day at CBC.
Thank you. And there was a follow-up question on your presentation about the multicultural outreach program. Can you explain how you track who your participants are? The asker of the question mentioned metrics about ethnicity, newcomer status, et cetera. How do you collect that information?
So the answer is no. We do not collect metrics on their status in Canada or their ethnicity in particular. But we do get some understanding from the organizations that we work with. So if the organization is an Afghan Women's Association, I'm just giving one of the examples. So we know that the kind of community people that they work with. So we get some understanding from there. We also work very closely with the English as a second language schools. So these are the places where newcomers go to learn English. So we know that most of their clientele are newcomers who are here in Canada and they're learning English. So we get some understanding of their background from these organizations.
Thank you. I'd like to direct the next question maybe to Nidhi. The question is, I'd like to hear some perspectives on whether to include anti-racism work within the diversity, equity, and inclusion framework that already exists, or whether to strike out with a new initiative specifically aimed at anti-racism.
I think anti-racism work is extremely important. We use nice words like DEI, and the racism piece is very, very important. And it starts with unconscious biases. There are many different ways and methods of doing it, and it depends really on the comfort within the organization. I'm happy to see that on this panel, we have brought in people who straddle different cultures and who come from different generations too. So yes, I just say yes, you should do it.
Would any of the other panel members like to speak to that question before I move on? Ashu?
So I would like to really add to what Nidhi was saying, and I think Rift Valley Conservation is echoing and trying to walk the talk. We have recently created last year our Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, and that committee is working to what Nidhi had ended her presentation with is, we're trying to do an audit for our organization to understand how our practices and our programs are structured. We're trying to see it through the lens of diversity, equity, inclusion, and racism. So I would also highly recommend that having a group of people that are focused on this area is very important to understand the nitty-gritty of our organizational culture.
And because I wasn't able to complete my presentation, I should mention that there is an emerging coalition called the Black Environmental Initiative, which you may know, and it includes NGOs like Environmental Defense, Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, CUPE, It goes, of course, beyond the environment, but Climate Action Network. And so that's the counter piece, which enables us to then collaborate with them.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions I'm going to combine a little together regarding consultation of Indigenous peoples in infrastructure projects. I know perhaps some of the panelists from conservation authorities, maybe Mark, maybe Nidhi, with your international experience, might be able to speak to the process of engaging Indigenous peoples on infrastructure project. And specifically, one of the questions related to when you say work with First Nations, does that include traditional Indigenous leaders or only elected band councils?
I'm happy to start very quickly with the standards that get established at international level. FIPIC, Free, Prior and Informed Consent, is one of the standing guidelines. It's voluntary. This is the thing, it's voluntary. But mining companies, forestry companies are all supposed to align their stakeholder consultations with those kinds of, requirements. And Ontario Nature, in fact, Canada doesn't practice FIPIC as it should. Ontario Nature put it into effect as a policy back in 2016, but I remember the board debate at the time was very illuminating for me to realize that there was so much bias against First Nations being consulted, and for that to become actually a policy. But it did become a policy.
Would anyone else like to touch on that topic before we move on to another?
One of the things that is important is that with different First Nations, there's different capabilities and different ways of approaching things. So it's not all the same. So in Duty Consult, some First Nations have staff that are like the Chippewas Attempts, they have professional staff dealing with that, but other First Nations are really challenged, and it's because of resources to do that. So if you are considering that area, you have to understand there's diversity also among the different First Nations and how they address it.
I'll direct this next question to Emma, but then there may be other panelists who'd like to speak to it. Emma, how could women be better involved in watershed decisions? What would need to change so that that could happen?
I think we need a new Conservation Act. I know it was just updated, but I believe as it stands, there's not even space for a board for Indigenous people to sit on. It's just the municipality. So even though there's 4 First Nations that touch onto the Thames River or that are within that watershed, we don't sit on any boards. We're not a part of kind of those decision making formally. So I know we've had discussions for maybe some type of external committee that we meet annually or twice a year, but I think that the act really needs to be changed or transformed. We need a new act that really provides more rights and allows First Nations to really carry out those responsibilities.
Would any of our other panelists like to touch on this? Okay, I'll move on to conservation areas. Has cost or admission fees been identified as a barrier to accessing conservation parks and activities for low-income families? And I think there has been a little bit of discussion and some observations within the chat and Q&A realms about providing, some agencies providing parks passes to local libraries for lending to allow access to those unable to pay the fees. Any other thoughts or experiences, ways of addressing this barrier that you're aware of?
So how we have been, dealing with this scenario is, yes, that is a barrier. I just want to recognize that over the last 11 years that I've been working in this field, paying the gate fee can be a big deterrent for people to get into the parks. And on top of that, if you have to pay for the transportation too, it kind of adds more into your budget for that recreation piece. So we have been offering, trips to our conservation areas through our internal budgets, and we cover the bus fee. And because we are able to cover their bus fee to come and visit our conservation areas, the numbers that I was quoting before have been that high, because these groups of people are able to come together and explore and experience natural areas in our parks. And if we will not be able to do that, those people will not have that opportunity to come, and they will never be able to, experience a day out in those natural areas.
Anyone else like to touch on that? Mark, whether it was one of your, I think it was TRCA and CVC that offered the passes through the library system. And Mark, I think you mentioned that you also offer free entry perhaps to your Indigenous partners. Other ways of addressing that challenge that you've seen from the conservation area field?
I think a number of conservation authorities address that through funding from their foundations, particularly in having youth attend programming at conservation areas through funds, should they not have those available because of their circumstances. I think that it is something that we have to continue to work on, because for a small conservation authority like us, we have very little charging that we do for use of our conservation areas, but we also don't have the major resources to or infrastructure to fund in those areas. So it's a bit of a rock in a hard place for many conservation authorities, needing the funding and also making it available.
A question directed to Rhiannon. Oh, it just scrolled on me. There we are. One of the participants is asking that you elaborate a little on your point about how streaming in schools is a barrier.
Mm-hmm. So there was actually recently set up a Black Scientist Network by a professor at U of T. And so I was part of some of the meetings with that. Everyone was like introduced to each other, and we chatted about barriers facing Black students in STEM. And something that was raised was the policy of streaming in Ontario schools, where Black students are consistently streamed into subjects that are less academic because of perceived biases in the school system, that they can't do these academic subjects and things like that. So there was a report written, and it found that 53% of Black students were in academic programs compared to 81% of white students and 80% of other racialized students. So the system is really streaming Black students out of more academic programs that might lead to kind of university educations and that sort of thing, and more into vocational streams. And it's part of systemic racism in the school system. But it does mean that less Black students end up in higher education because of this streaming process that doesn't allow them to choose.
As we're working towards our final minutes, I'd like to offer a final question from those that have been submitted that maybe a few panelists might like to touch on. Could you speak to how we can address or overcome the hesitation and fear of saying and doing the wrong thing when starting work on diversity, equity, inclusion, and racism, and having conversations with BIPOC communities about these topics? Maybe I would ask Rhiannon to start if she'd like to contribute a thought on that.
It's a difficult one, and I think everyone would probably give you a different answer. I often say, I think it's better to say something than to say nothing. Obviously, be mindful of what you're saying, but I think silence is always the wrong option. And be aware that when you are saying something, you should be open to criticism or to altering what you have said if you get feedback that, you know, we think this wasn't quite the right thing, or we think you should have said it like this. Don't kind of double down and be like, well, that's not what we meant. Just, you know, like be open to communication around what you are saying.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Emma?
Yeah, I do agree with Rhiannon. I think it's better to say something than to just ignore it. But I think people really need to do their own research and spend that time doing their own reading. I know for just in Chippewa, we get requests a lot of the time for information on our history or to write a land acknowledgement. And that's really defeating the purpose of learning for yourselves and for doing that education. And I mean, after you've done the education, for sure, come to us. We're happy to have a conversation, but don't come to us with your baseline as 0. Just take that time to learn.
Thank you for that. Any of other speakers want to touch on this in our final minute or two?
I'll just say that Sustainability Network has been doing this kind of work. Initially in 2009, it was called the Environment and Diversity. We did a program on First Peoples, New Peoples, and subsequently something on reconciliation. But I'll put some links down for everyone later, I guess. But I do think that having a facilitated discussion is important. Having the Chatham rules in place and some mutual respect guidelines put in, established is always a good way. And the idea that we're not there to judge, but that we are in a period of history where we want to move forward helps.
Thank you, Nidhi. I think that was a great note to wrap it up on. I think this discussion has been insightful and hopefully motivating for everyone involved. I'd like to take another moment to thank our speakers and panelists for giving us their time, for sharing their lived experiences and their learnings with us, and for their work to help build inclusion, equity, and diversity into the conservation sector. Hopefully we can take away some of the learnings that Nidhi shared with us in terms of showing some ambition for advancing that enlightened agenda, for re-examining our own biases and looking both within our organizations and outside to try to foster some change. Thank you also to the participants for the questions that you contributed and your willingness to spend the morning learning with us, for the great suggestions and additions that you made to the chat box. Lots of great links to resources there. It's our hope that today's presentations and conversations have sparked in you an idea on how you can take action in your own personal or professional realm to keep these conversations going and push the conversation into action. This webinar has been brought to you by the Laternal Symposium Steering Committee, and I'd really like to thank those who made it happen, including Jamie Judry, who's our Symposium Program Chair, Nikisha Mohammed and Jane Lewington from Conservation Ontario, Carrie Ann Charles from Cambion Aboriginal, Ashu Anand from CVC, and Mario Mallet and Karen Anderson from Allset Inc., who are all part of the planning committee for this webinar. This is the 4th webinar in the Laternal Leadership Project series. If you missed our first 3 webinars, you can view the recordings at laternal.ca, and the recording for this webinar should be posted within a few days. We have one more webinar planned in the current series, and it's called What Makes a Good Leader? And it will be hosted in late February, so please keep your eye out for more information about that webinar. And if you haven't already, please take a look at our newsletter, which you can sign up for at laternal.ca. And thank you for joining us on the Laternal Leadership Project. One final thing to do before you leave, please give us feedback on our webinar series by completing some of the poll questions you see. Anyway, thank you all for your time. Please stay safe and stay connected with one another.